Well, Loyal, your Amythia, Crisis in the Natural History of Western Culture. I read this book, now it was published in 1989, and I read it probably about 1990, 91, something like that. And when I read this book, I learned that I actually had a missing. I had a malady that's common to our culture. I was amythic. I just thought you were the greatest thing since William James, basically. You remember, I sent you, we didn't have an email in that time. I must have sent you a letter, right?
I don't remember that, but I remember the William James reference. And I was deeply embarrassed by that. When I was in college, I read varieties of religious experience. I was deeply moved by that book. I thought it was terrific because it provided a take on religion, an approach to religion that I hadn't encountered before. And so that, I think that sort of turned my thinking toward religion in a new mode. And this book, Amythia, is one of a number of books that I've worked on that kept that perspective going. This idea that religion is something that you can study and not just something that you practice. And so the book, Amythia, was inspired, I think, by my frustration with the notion that culture and nature are sort of ontologically distinct. I mean, two different domains. That bothered me because I thought, I was thinking of religion as something natural. And the whole notion that culture and nature are distinct was something that I thought was controversial. And I think in the late 80s it was still controversial. People thought of history as something that transcends nature. And certainly people that thought in religious terms viewed history as something that transcends nature. History is God's drama, and nature is just nothing but the stage on which this sacred history is played out. And so Amythia tries to get at a number of things, actually, but one thing it tries to get at is this dichotomy between nature and culture. And so I tried to develop an approach that I called a natural history of culture. I tended to view culture as a biological adaptation. And so that puts culture and history smack in the context of nature. And so that book tries to overcome that dichotomy between nature and history, and tries to set out the principles of a natural history of culture. And so that's what I was playing at in that book, to start. I don't know if it was a new discipline, but it was, for me, it was natural history of culture.
Anyone reading Amythia may be surprised, particularly the time, 1989 it was published, may be surprised that you were a professor in the philosophy and religion department at a place called Luther College in the heart of conservative America. Were you afraid in any way? Did you hold back in any way in what you said in this book, Amythia?
No, I didn't. I wasn't worried about that. It's interesting, actually, because there was a controversy that followed that book and the subsequent book. The controversy was that there are a lot of very conservative alums out there, and some of them came after me, and they approached the president and said, if this guy doesn't go, then you don't get any more money from us, that sort of thing. In fact, there was in Cedar Falls, where you guys were recently, there's a big church, a big Lutheran church down there, and the pastor, who was well known, he had a radio program and he was a public figure, and a Luther grad, and he was outraged. And he wanted to bring his church council up to Decorah to meet with me and to grill me. And and the president called me and said, you know, here's what's going to happen. These people are going to come up here and visit with you. I hope you're ready for that. And I said, why are they coming up here? Why don't I go down there? Bring Muhammad to the mountains. So I drove down to Cedar Falls and walked into this room, and here's this church council all sitting around, loaded, ready to skewer me. And before we got started, I just went around the room and shook hands with each person, asked their name, looked them in the eye, and gave it a little personal touch. Mm-hmm. And when we sat down and started in, it was not a problem. Wow. There was another guy. This was the guy. I won't use his name, but he was the guy who had the the Western States franchise for Adidas.
Okay.
And he was a Luther grad. He heard noises, and I think this was after a AAAS, American Academy of Science meeting, and I gave a talk there, and that got picked up by a bunch of newspapers, and he read it, and he was upset. So he came down. He wanted to come down and meet this guy, and he was angry, and he had real money.
Yeah.
So he took me out to lunch, and as it turned out, all he wanted to know was whether I belonged to the clan, whether I was part of his tribe. He asked me where my family came from. He asked me if I was Norwegian. Mm-hmm. He asked me what my connection was to Luther College, all these things, and he was satisfied that I was part of the tribe.
Yep.
So he didn't care about the theological implications of anything I was saying. It was a tribal thing.
Are you in group?
Yeah.
All right. Well, not only were you, who's that Orlean person on that? That's
my father.
Okay, so your father was a Lutheran.
He was a Lutheran pastor.
Right, okay, so that's even more so.
Yeah.
Well, you know what occurs to me in that story is that here we are, 2014, and it's 25 years after the publication of Amythia. And very recently, we've had the rise of the new atheists out there who are also, because it's becoming more public, an alternative of completely leaving the church, complete secularism, and many, many deeply religious people of long lineage, Lutherans and other, are seeing their children and grandchildren, quote, leave the church. And what Amythia offers there is one of the ways in which to accommodate what's attractive to these young people and unattractive in staying in traditional church, while emphasizing the importance of staying in the church. Let's evolve the church.
That's an interesting issue, and my thinking has changed about the church recently. I think in that book, I was convinced that that there had to be a new story, and that the story had to be distinctive. That it had to have some kind of continuity with the past. Yet it had to be plausible. It had to be intelligible. It couldn't be intellectually embarrassing. And so you have these two criteria. One is the distinctiveness or the continuity with the past. The other is the plausibility. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was working out in Amythia, trying to hold up these two criteria and look for the arts, actually, to call the arts forward to give shape to a new story. The distinctiveness of the tradition was the covenant, and the plausibility had to do with the scientific worldview. Mm-hmm. And what you have, and this is, I think, part of the problem of Amythia, you have the myth, the story, the covenant story, embedded in a cosmology that's unbelievable. Mm-hmm. Mm. So how do you get that cosmology, or how do you get that distinctive notion of the covenant out of that ancient cosmology and implant it into a plausible cosmology? That's the problem.
Well, that's so much of what my work now is about. In a large part, what I'm trying to do now is exactly sort of the work that when I read Amythia and rereading it now, I feel like this is what I'm trying to do right now, which is basically take big history and say, how can the mythic elements of Christianity be reframed in a totally naturalistic, this world realistic way? So, for example, covenant becomes our covenant with reality. And serving the future is what, or saving the future now in terms of climate change. To be a Christian is to be a savior of the future. The church, if the church is going to have any viable destiny, it's going to be where it takes responsibility for ensuring a healthy future. So it takes on being the second coming of Christ, not waiting for it, some supernatural event or whatever. So I'm trying to take some of those elements of Christianity and say they're too deeply embedded in sort of Western culture to just trash the whole thing. There's some profound elements as long as they're reinterpreted in a totally science-based, naturalistic, and an inspiring way, in a way that inspires people.
And that's not terribly difficult to do. I mean, if you think about what the covenant is, now I'm thinking now about the Hebraic covenant. If you mention that to people, most of them will say, okay, that's the 613 laws of the Old Testament, right? Or the 10 Commandments, that's the covenant. But if you abstract that a little bit and look at the text, what you find is that the covenant is presented as the conditions of existence. If you follow these conditions, if you fulfill these requirements, then you will live.
Right.
If you don't, you will die.
Exactly.
Okay, so if that's the covenant, the conditions of existence, then we can simply ask, well, what are the conditions of existence? How is that understood now in the 21st century? How do we understand the conditions of existence?
Yeah.
And then we think about things like global warming and fresh water and the environmental problems that we have. And if we abide by those conditions, we will live.
Yeah.
And
that God is speaking that reality, again, when I use the word God, I'm always meaning reality personified. That reality is communicating that to us primarily not through old men or old books, but through evidence, all forms of evidence.
Right, exactly. So I think, and I was inspired by that. I thought, okay, now if we understand the covenant, the distinctiveness of the tradition, if we understand that as the conditions of existence, then how do people in the contemporary world understand the conditions of existence? That's a science-informed process. And so we should be able to go into the churches and present them with this distinctiveness and this plausibility issue and change thinking. And so I was really trying to encourage people. I think in that book, Amythia, I was trying to encourage the arts to help us do that, but also trying to encourage people to go back into the churches. Don't leave for silly reasons. Don't leave just because you don't believe in God anymore. But that's a bad reason. If you believe in the conditions of existence, that's enough. Then you are heirs of the covenant promise. So I was encouraging people to go back into the churches and transform the churches. I was convinced that this was important because there is a church, in this country at least, in the Western world, a church basically within walking distance of everybody in the culture. That's a system. That's a distribution system that you can't ignore. And I thought, okay, why let that go? Why let that go into the hands of the people that are science deniers and reactionaries and so on? Why not bring sophisticated people back into the church and help with this transposition of the covenant from an old cosmology to a new cosmology? I have since changed my thinking about that, and I admire the work that you guys are doing, going into the churches, doing exactly that. But well, it's been 25 years since that book appeared, and I just don't see the churches responding in any kind of constructive way. So I think it's I've sort of given up on that on the churches.
Yeah. Well, and in my experience, there's two parallel streams. There's there are people within every religion that are reframing, reinterpreting, grounding their religion in an evidential worldview, sort of embracing ecology and evolution. and the worldview of ecology and evolution. And there are those outside of religion or outside of the traditional religions that are, from a purely secular perspective, that is, they value evidence, are coming to find a sacred or inspiring or meaningful or whatever language you want to use, but they're coming to embrace some of what religion offered in the past, personal wholeness, social coherence, for example, and they're doing so outside of any organized religion. And I think both those streams are necessary.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's going to happen within the church necessarily in the way that that's going to lead culture. Doubtful.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are, I'm trying to basically sort of shock religious people in saying that we've been blind and deaf to what God's been revealing, what reality's been revealing for 500 years because of this idolatry of the written word and idolatry of the otherworldly. So I'm trying to say basically, Thomas Berry used the term autistic, that we've been spiritually autistic, living in our own world, because we don't have an I-thou relationship with nature. We don't hear the voices of the rivers and the climate and all that kind of stuff.
We still have the problem of Amythia, though.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still there. That is, a culture, in order to be a coherent, functional culture, needs to have a story that people sign on to.
Correct.
To guide their actions, also to justify their actions. So a story that we all, many of us, most of us, affirm is essential. And we don't have that. We have many, many, many stories. It's still proliferating. We're getting too many meanings. And then culture comes apart. It just gets ragged and people can't communicate and they can't cooperate. And so we need to gather around a story, and that's a very, very slow process. Maybe our problem is that we're a little bit too impatient. I'm not sure, but the problem of Amythia hasn't gone away, I don't think.
Right. No, I agree. Your book, Everybody's Story, before the term big history was used, you wrote Everybody's Story, Wising Up to the Epic of Evolution. And this is, I've come to call myself a big history evangelist. Mm-hmm. I think the only story that can unite us is the Epic of Evolution, or the universe story, or big history, what we call the great story. And yes, there will be many different interpretations of that story, and so, Hindus will interpret it one way, or Buddhists another, and Christians another. But it's like the skeleton. The skeleton is the story, is the science of the Epic of Evolution, and then sort of the mythic lens through which the various traditions interpret it, I think, is going to be unique. But I see the only possible mythic narrative is big history.
Yeah, I quite agree. It's strange, though, isn't it? We've got this world, which in many ways is one world now, with communication and travel and so on. We're all united. We're all kind of on the same. With the internet, everybody's sort of reading the same stuff at the same time. So it's one world in a way, but it's many, many, many stories that are competing, and that's not a very healthy thing. I think I used to hear colleagues of mine talk about how important it was to bring religions together and to have this interfaith dialogue. And I always thought that it's premature to have an interfaith dialogue, that there's nothing to be gained by bringing Buddhists and Christians and Jews together to talk about the spiritual aspects of life. First, let each of the various traditions come to terms with the new cosmology. First, let Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism and Islam, let each of these traditions settle their differences with science. Then come together and talk about the spiritual aspect.
And I don't think that's going to happen within Christianity unless a lot of Christians, embrace evidence as modern-day scripture.
Yeah.
So Loyal, one of the things that I'm sensing now, I know when I first read the book, I thought it was only non-theists, non-believers, religious naturalists like me, who were amythic. And traveling around the country, going into churches, my own Unitarian Universalism, very liberal, but also Michael in some of the liberal arms of whatever tradition there is in Christianity, I'm getting a sense now that most of the people sitting in the pews are amythic. They don't believe that story any more than I do. And so, is it your view that even the people still going to church are amythic, not just people like me and their kids that don't go to church?
Yeah, of course my question is, why are they there if they don't believe this? They're there perhaps out of habit, perhaps...
Well, community, a sense of community.
A sense of community. That's where their friends are. They think it's important for their kids to go to church, that sort of thing.
For moral values.
Yeah. They and perhaps they're getting something, but they aren't getting the message that's based in a believable cosmology. And so, in a way, amythic, perhaps even schizophrenic. They bring, they sort of check their cosmology at the door and go in and listen to the stories, and perhaps they can get something from it, not as much as they could perhaps. But.
Right, and it also seems to me that even the most religiously conservative evangelical forms of Christianity in America, part of the reason that they stay to it so much probably goes with the whole idea that Thomas Kuhn had with the paradigm shifts, in terms of when you start to realize there's some cracks in your worldview, you have to hold on to it tight, because we can't survive amythic without a worldview. And unless they've got one ready to go that can give them as much sense of salvation, sense of possibility, certainly being able to maintain a church community, they're not going to go there.
I think what I hear Connie saying is that if people think that by letting go of their worldview, their religion, their what gave their life meaning and gave them consistent access to these feeling states, and they're not provided if they think that they're going to have to then live without that sense of trust. It's just a meaningless universe. They're not going to do it. They're going to resist that emotionally.
Right. I'm amazed at how long it takes for people to change their worldviews. It seems in my own life it happened fairly rapidly. The more I learned about the natural world and how things work, and the more I studied science, the more I got the impression that nature is amazing, that there is a kind of spiritual aspect to nature. And the supernatural was so remote, and the natural world was so immediate and so interesting and so complex and so creative that I thought, well, it's got it all. And so I don't know. I was sort of bothered in my own story. I mean, I was bothered by the burdens that religion put on me, and like every little kid is, I suppose. And it just didn't. The music got me, but that's all. I didn't make a complete break with my past. I didn't sort of slough off my entire tradition. I just changed the way I processed those things. And so in the last chapter of that book, there are little sections on creation and salvation and grace and all these sort of Lutheran themes that were there throughout my childhood. Those themes themselves are still functional, but in a naturalistic context. And so when I, as a child, I used to think of salvation as my soul going away to heaven for eternity. The whole notion of salvation is still there, but now I see it in terms of saving or preserving natural systems and social systems. That's the salvation. Grace, the great Lutheran theme, is still there, but I don't think of it in terms of God's gift. I think of it in terms of nature's gift, that I did not create myself. I did not create the world that sustains me. I accept that as a gift that I did not earn. That's grace. But it's grace in a naturalistic setting.
One of the symptoms, or one of the consequences of amythia, is that we no longer have an I-thou relationship. We don't have a personal relationship to reality. We don't have a personal relationship to nature. We basically treat nature as an it to be exploited by us rather than a thou to be related to. So I'm trying to use that personal metaphor and saying that if you claim to have a personal relationship to God and you think of God as outside the universe, but you don't have a respectful, honorable relationship to time, nature, and mystery, which I see as the three sort of faces of reality, that these are real whether we believe in them or not, then you don't have a personal relationship to God. So I'm trying to reframe what it even means to have a personal God or God as person, and to say that basically nature, reality, time, if we continue to relate to reality as merely an it, we will cause our own extinction. So I'm trying to value the personal metaphor, but basically saying we need to have a personal relationship to what's inescapably real, and that is to be a right relationship to God.
Yeah. Well, the metaphor God as person, the way I view this is that every story, and of course we need a story in order to guide our behavior and justify our actions and so on. And that the essence of a story is to give us an artful integration of cosmology and morality, and to bring those things together in one coherent piece. And metaphors do that. The metaphor of God as person does that. It brings cosmology together with morality. How does it do that? Well, here you have one God, one being, who is the creator of the universe, and that same being is the creator of the moral order. So that God is the ultimate explanation for reality, and also the ultimate justification for moral behavior. So explanation and justification are united in this one metaphor, God as person. If the metaphor, God as person, loses its plausibility, then explanation and justification fall apart, and you don't have this integration. That, I think, is a major part of our worries, is how to bring morality and cosmology together. What metaphor will do it? God as person won't do it. God as turtle won't do it. God as computer won't do it. This is the Judeo-Christian Islamic metaphor, God as person. Other traditions do it differently. The Vedic tradition uses the concept of dharma. The ancient Greek tradition uses the concept of logos. There are different notions, different ways. The Tao in Chinese tradition, these are metaphors too that integrate cosmology and morality. When we lose the plausibility of God as person, we need another metaphor.
Well, I've been trying to use God as
to bring these together.
God as reality personified. So if we interpret the word God as being reality personified, then we regain what you call the confusion, the coming together of sort of facts and values. We gain that by the whole field of both evolutionary religious studies, understanding religion from a science-based perspective, but also the whole understanding of morality, like Michael Shermer's book, The Science of Good and Evil, and Franz de Waal's work on sort of how morality emerges from nature. Can jive if you understand God as a personification of reality, not a supernatural person. I've been in the last few years talking about personification, getting that our brains inherently personify as the most important scientific discovery about religion in the last 100 years. I mean, that's the sort of the hype, or the way I'm framing it. Because Stuart Guthrie in this book, Faces in the Cloud, gets into that in spades. Connie and I do it in a real personal way. So we play with it, but it's still just as emotionally nourishing and meaningful to us as any personification, unconscious, has ever been. For example, we personify Nora, is our personified name for North America. So we don't call this continent North America, we call this continent Nora. So we've got this intimate personal relationship with Nora, even though we often in our language speak of Nora like she's got a consciousness, but we obviously know that that's not the case. But nonetheless, we get the emotional bennies as if we did.
Right, as Nora is so thrilled. We're spending some time in Iowa, which we'd ignored Iowa. And we're discovering how beautiful the countryside is here. And so Nora is just so thrilled that we're experiencing this part of her.
Right. But we've done the same thing with our relationship. There's Connie, there's Michael, and then there's Jasmine. So Jasmine is the mythic personification that we've given for us, or for we.
So, yeah.
Angel is the personification of our van.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay, this is interesting because some people just can't do that. Some people, I mean, I think you probably have this deep sense of irony, knowing that there's no way really to talk about these things without metaphors. So let's create metaphors all over the place and use them, and we get the emotional goodies from them. Some people don't get the emotional goodies unless they're convinced that the metaphor is something real, that is something beyond, something that's there beyond their own consciousness, beyond their own mind. Something uncreated by themselves.
I don't believe that's true. I've encountered about a dozen people who at first were like this, but then they actually, when I convince them to actually try it, to actually make up a metaphor for their relationship with their wife or whatever, however they do it. And once you live inside that and you actually realize you don't have to believe it literally to get the emotional bennies, you know, I've had staunch atheists who both basically said, you know, it's just not real.
Okay, I got to chime in here. If you know enough about our evolved brain, you know there are aspects of our brain that are deeper than thought. And so for what we've done for the sun, which we call great soul,
we sing with great soul.
We did it this morning. We did it last night. We sing when the sun rises.
High, great soul,
we love you so. We sang to great soul sitting there in the west yesterday. So I directly access my singing emotional side in order so that it doesn't just become an intellectual principle, but now it's a big part of our lives.
I know there's something going on there in the brain, some sort of suspension of disbelief, right? You suspend it's like a joke. You accept the bit. Right? And
no,
you get the joke.
It's more than that. Neither one of us are postmodernists in any way. It's not suspension of something. It's a bringing into, and it's real.
It's tapping into our evolved brain and what triggers the emotions, and things like music do, things like anything that gives us an I-thou relationship. The idea that it's only going to be meaningful if I believe that literally great soul has a consciousness, bullshit. It's just we play with it, but we get all the emotional benefits as if when I believed God was a supernatural person. For me now, God is reality, nature, time personified. I get all those same emotional benefits, and I've influenced a fair number of staunch humanist, atheist, free thinkers that just reject all the mythic bullshit. But then they actually play with it, and they realize, my God, you know. And in one case, this guy who's the head of the Humanist Society in St. Louis. He started doing that with his wife. They named their relationship in the way that we've named Jasmine, which is us. That he did that, and he said it's incredible. It's just it's made a huge difference emotionally.
But getting back to what you were calling forth in your last chapter, very prophetic, the language you used, you were specifically calling for the artists, the songwriters, the playwrights, and so forth. And I, in particular, have taken that on. I mean,
I know you have.
We have evolutionary parables that certainly please adults, but the thought that I bring some of these to kids, and that they're playfully wonderful, they've got all the aspects of cultivating virtue, and but they're anthropomorphizing things like stars and so forth. And so why I've focused so much on kids, I've done a lot of stuff on bringing the epic of evolution to kids, is I go into my own mind and I think, had my church experience brought nature into it, not just in an abstract way, but all the best stories, all the songs. And then as I grew up, learning that those were real, not fantasies, they were real. You don't have to give up any of these things from the parables. How deep would the epic of evolution be in me had I experienced it as a child?
I think Amythia certainly struck a chord with you. I don't know that it was that original. I mean, certainly Nietzsche saw this, and in fact, a lot of what goes on in Amythia is echoes of Nietzsche. I wasn't trying to refresh Nietzsche. I wasn't aware of that, but Nietzsche was concerned that the mythos had died, that it was no longer plausible, and that the consequence was going to be nihilism.
Yeah.
And that frightened him. And so, because personal wholeness and social coherence begin to degrade rapidly when there's no story, when there's no unifying story. And it frightened him, and so he was opposed to nihilism. He accepted nihilism as a fact, and tried to address it or tried to overcome it, and that's where the arts came in. I mean, he was so big on living our lives as a work of art, because art was the only thing that could overcome Amythia.